Allow me to introduce tonight's author, Mariam Goshadze, who has held the position of Junior Professor of the Study of Religion at Leipzig University since 2023. She completed her PhD in Religious Studies at Harvard University, undertaking visiting periods at the Central European University in Budapest, at the University of Utrecht, where she was a member of the Religious Matters Project. She then joined the DFG research group Multiple Secularities Beyond the West, Beyond Modernities here in Leipzig, as a senior research fellow. Subsequently, she worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bayreuth. Tonight, she will present her debut monograph published last year by Duke University Press, The Noise Silence Makes, Secularity and Ghana's Drum Wars, a book about sound power and the nature of the secular. Mariam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bernadette, for introducing me. I want to thank everyone for being here today. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to talk a little more about my book. I want to particularly thank Recent Globe and Druckfrisch, especially Roman Kawilitsky, for facilitating the whole discussion. And without further ado, let me go ahead and start. My very first visit to Accra in 2014 marked a point of departure for my research. I was wandering around the suburb of La Paz with a friend when I was struck by the realization that the city was buzzing, humming, panting, and puffing all along our promenade. I had never encountered a city that breathed so loudly. My friend was dismissive. This is nothing. This month is quiet because of the ban. I was intrigued. The ban? What ban? The Ga ban on noise for Homo. You didn't know? He asked, clearly amused by my ignorance. While I was familiar with the Ga community of Accra and their harvest festival, Homo, I was unaware of the ban on noise. The news was riveting, since it meant that the followers of the Ga religion were not only regulating the soundscape of the metropolis, but they were also doing so far from the city center, where their authority was concentrated. This reality flew in the face of the established scholarly narrative that Pentecostal charismatic Christianity had swallowed up across religious market, prevailing over traditional religions, and permeating almost every dimension of urban life. What I have just read to you is the opening of my book, and an opening into my interest in the Ga community in Accra and the ritual restriction on noise. I had come to Ghana during my second year of PhD studies. It was my very first time in the country, and my goal was to reach the north, where I wanted to research the notorious witch camps. Once I learned about the ban on drumming, however, I was sure that this is what I wanted to write about. Why, you might ask? Because this is a powerful example of the vitality of African religions, even in a thriving metropolis like Accra. I was also wary of the classical ethnographic model of going to a remote village to observe traditional religious practices as survivals of the past. I wanted to see how they operated in the city amidst all the hustle and bustle, amidst the Pentecostal charismatic Christianity that had swept over the country and was proclaimed as the most modern expression of religiosity. African religions in an urban context have received some attention in recent literature, but primarily through their entanglement with different forms of Christianity. What I wanted to do with this work is to offer counter-narratives that present African religions as an authority dictating the terms of engagement with Christianity rather than the other way around. The Ga community members have occupied the territories of present-day Accra for centuries, and according to oral history, they have observed their pre-festival restrictions on noise since that time. The festival itself commemorates a great famine in the past and celebrates another year of harvest and survival. According to customary law, the Ga community members are the official guardians of Accra's lands. Now, what does that mean? In much of Ghana, land has historically been understood not as a private property owned by individuals or by the state or by post-colonial state as well, but also pre-colonial rather ancestral and collective property managed by different cultural communities as represented by the chief. Ironically, the system of indirect rule during British colonialism strengthened, at least bureaucratically, the role of chiefs as intermediaries. It also institutionalized customary law. The post-colonial state maintained this system by recognizing traditional authorities as custodians or guardians of the land. What this means in practice is that the Ga community has some say in how the land in the capital is being managed, both administratively and ritually, which also, of course, includes the imposition of ritual restrictions. These ritual regulations were observed without any major issues in the post-independence era until the late 1990s, when Pentecostal charismatic congregations started to refuse pausing their music in order to honor. In response, the Ga community members, led by ritual specialists, attacked the transgressing churches, ransacking the premises and physically assaulting the congregation members. So heated became the antagonism in the early 2000s that the state had to intervene and take the responsibility for regulating the city's soundscape. To give you a general sense of the book, let me summarize the two main arguments that run through it. First, I look at the history of noise regulation in Accra as an inversion of the colonial top-down noise management techniques. I argue that the ban on drumming challenges the long-established power dynamics inherent in the noise abatement practices. While in the early colonial context, secular and Christian registers were conflated to make up, quote unquote, progressive sensory order that was then juxtaposed against the disagreeable sound of, quote unquote, heathenism. Today, the secular register blends with indigenous sensibilities, which are then mobilized against the noise of what is popularly considered the most modern Christian movement. Importantly, a community that is usually sidelined in public discourse, that is the Ga community, or generally, traditional communities, is responsible for deploying this bottom-up noise regulation venture. Second, I believe that the case study represents a microcosm for understanding secularity in Ghana and in other parts of Africa, where the state is reluctant to grant the status of religion to indigenous religious traditions due to the long history of marginalization by missionaries and colonial administrative systems. In the new secular framework, Christianity and Islam are considered more acceptable religious forms, while indigenous practices are continuously adapted to fit the bill. What the case demonstrates, however, is that behind this external framework, customary authorities and practices maintain an undeniable sway over the city, as evidenced by how the state resolved the conflict in favor of the Ga community members, a topic that I will discuss shortly. The state of affairs, I argue, is facilitated by Ghana's parallel system of justice, the co-presence of modern constitutional law with a plurality of customary laws. The confrontations surrounding the ban form the nucleus of the book, from which I branch out into the past to tell the story of the colonial techniques of power, and into the future to discuss the current management of the festival. Beyond secularity and noise regulation, this is also a history of minority politics, religious pluralism, and human rights. The book is the result of a combination of historiographical and ethnographic research as part of my extended stay in Accra between 2014 and 2018. I interviewed dozens of state representatives, leaders, and members of Christian and traditional communities, as well as legal specialists. I attended numerous traditional celebrations. I was also fortunate to live very close to the National Archives of Ghana, which meant that I could regularly visit to dig through colonial administrative documents from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And in the absence of official documentation on the festival and the ban on drumming in the post-independence era, I turned to periodicals, focusing particularly on Daily Graphic, the daily national newspaper published since the early 1950s. This was a treasure trove of sorts that enabled me to reconstruct the history of the ban and the festival in the second half of the 20th century. The book, as I already mentioned, unfolds in three movements: the events leading up to the confrontations around the drums, then the drum wars and their legal dimensions, and the emergence of alternative celebrations from the 2010 onwards. I divide the events leading up to the confrontations into two major time periods, the colonial era and the post-independence period. From the colonial period, I was particularly interested in the introduction of noise restriction campaigns in the Gold Coast after it became a British colony in 1874. At that point, noise abatement campaigns had just been introduced in Europe and North America as an effective technique for keeping the minority and marginalized populations in check, such as immigrants, lower classes, women, and then later colonial subjects. The sonic categories and sensibilities underlying the noise abatement campaigns were transplanted to the British colonies of West Africa as well in the form of public nuisance ordinances. On paper, these targeted excessive sounds in populated areas produced by anyone, but in practice, the restrictions were exclusively applied to the members of the local community who deviated from norms of sonic propriety, modeled after the British sonic sensibilities, which were, of course, influenced by the Christian ideas of religious propriety. This meant that sounds produced in the context of indigenous ceremonies were particularly likely to be classified as problematic because they were considered as threatening on a spiritual level, in addition to being considered noisy. The drum, in particular, emerged as the object of state control, especially in the early 20th century, undoubtedly due to its central role in the ritual life of the Gold Coast inhabitants. Of course, in the post-independence era, we see a major shift in how African religious and customary practices are viewed. As part of nationalist and pan-Africanist agendas to revive the quote-unquote authentic African identity, the drum and other customary practices came to be celebrated as valuable aspects of the past. The first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, was eager to incorporate drumming and dancing in all major public events, and this cultural orientation persisted throughout decades, with a particular high point in the 1980s. Amidst such cultural revival, Homowo and its associated customs were elevated above the Gaga community level to the national stage. However, this also meant that they were significantly culturalized. Greater visibility of the festival also meant increased public visibility of the ban on drumming in the 1980s, which was likely an outcome of two other factors: the newly emerging concern over noise pollution as a public nuisance, as evidenced by the numerous sound-related complaints submitted to newspapers throughout the 80s and the 90s, and the unprecedented rise of Pentecostal charismatic Christianity, which had started to attract younger populations due to its emphasis on material well-being, lively services, and problem-solving orientation. The second movement, the period of the drum wars, is the nucleus of the book. It is also the densest part of the book theoretically, as I elaborate on my approach to Ghanaian secularity and introduce the notion of culturalization, which is key to the book's conceptual framework. At the height of the tensions, both conflicting sides started to argue for their case from a legal perspective. However, they chose two distinct lines of defense. Pentecostal charismatic Christians insisted on their freedom to practice any religion and to manifest such practice. And God community members argued their case from the perspective of the right to enjoy, practice, profess, maintain, and promote any culture, language, tradition, or religion with a particular emphasis on culture. This right to practice culture then was interpreted in terms of the right to practice culturally law and customary law and popularized as such. This is important since by resorting to the distinction between culture and religion, the two groups were engaging with the long history of the culturalization of indigenous practices. There was a general reluctance in missionary approaches, early anthropology, and the study of religion, as well as the British colonial period, to recognize indigenous rituals as religion because the category itself was modeled on Judeo-Christian traditions, rendering all other forms of religion inferior in some way. The culturalization of indigenous practices was thus a way of denying them the status of religion. However, here is where the interesting dimension of the case study emerges. Despite the drawbacks of culturalization, the drum wars reveal the unexpected advantages of the cultural label. By insisting on the right to practice culture rather than religion, the God community members were able to circumvent some of the legislative restrictions imposed on religion. Thus, somewhat paradoxically, the colonial past became something of an asset in the drum wars. The state had to step in to resolve the tensions. However, this intervention was indirect. Participants were persuaded not to press charges, especially Pentecostal charismatic churches who had incurred most kind of attacks and property damage. New urban noise regulation initiatives were introduced instead. This culminated in the establishment of the Nuisance Control Task Force, an interinstitutional body that enforced a noise limit in the city due to the alleged public health concerns. And in this picture, you can see the Nuisance Control Task Force in action. You can also see the first leader of the Nuisance Control Task Force, who accidentally was a God traditional priest. If you want to hear more about that, we can talk about that later. The bylaw that governed these initiatives clearly stated that the goal was curbing urban noise pollution rather than forcing Christian churches to comply with the orders from God community members. However, in practice, the task force only came together during the period of the ban to address potential transgressions. Additionally, the state began issuing an annual notice warning Christians to confine their worship to church premises and minimize noise levels. The statement had to be advisory, given that the state had no right to impose indigenous ritual restrictions on the churches. This would be a clear case of favoritism, as imposing any religious practices on citizens of Ghana violates their right to practice their religion, which I mentioned before. The initiatives were framed as necessary measures to promote communal harmony and interfaith dialogue. This is a curious case because it exemplifies the multi-layered epistemologies of the contemporary Ghanaian public sphere. The official, institutional, and legal layers, which mimic the Euro-American model of governance, lifestyle, and discursive profile, coexist alongside the unofficial, customary, and community-centered orientation, which recognizes indigenous custodianship of land and prioritizes shared religious spaces. This also translates into parallel secularities that continue to empower customary authorities via loopholes and deviations from the official secularism. The third movement of the book concerns the two Homo War-related post-conflict initiatives from the 2010s, launched by the Ministry of Culture and the Christian Council of Ghana, respectively. These initiatives are interesting because, on the one hand, they convey an appreciation for traditional celebrations, while on the other hand, they subject traditional religious practices to selection and classification with the goal of neutralizing them for national consumption. Let me say just a few words about each of these initiatives. The Homo War Thanksgiving, designed by the Christian Council of Ghana, with Reverend Kwabena Opuni Frimpong as the mastermind behind it, is celebrated during the Homo War season to strengthen interreligious relationships and adopt some of the festival's core ideas. The lectures that accompany the services emphasize the shared interests of Christians and the Ga community members in maintaining a long life and showing respect for ancestors as community leaders. HomoFest is an undertaking by the Ministry of Culture aimed at unifying Ga celebrations into a national event. It can be understood in light of Rosalind Hackett's concept of festivalization of traditional religions in West Africa, which refers to the practice of paying disproportionate attention to the entertainment value of traditional rituals and celebrations while sidelining their religious components. HomoFest is interesting in its own right, since it transpires in parallel to the ritual event, managed and run by the Ga ritual specialists who maintain the festival's religious focus. All right, as I wrap up, I'll just say a few words about the book's potential contribution. In terms of its approach, the book complements several clusters of literature. On the one hand, it can be grouped with works that combine a sensory and political interpretation of sound and listening, such as Charles Hirschkind's Ethical Soundscape, or with works that focus on sensory dimensions of law, like James Parker's Acoustic Jurisprudence. The book section on respective sonic understandings of the two groups also corresponds to recent works on sensory ethnography. And in terms of its focus on secularity, particularly the on-the-ground negotiations of the secular in the context of Africa, the book represents a small but gradually growing field as captured in the recently published African Secularity source book by the KFG Multiple Secularities, run by my colleagues Christoph Kleiner here and Monika Wohlratzer. Because of its interdisciplinary approach and style of writing, I try to write in an accessible and jargon-free language. The book may appeal to across disciplines to students and colleagues beyond the study of religion, including those in anthropology, African and Africana studies, history, urban studies, and legal studies. Ultimately, this is a story about a minority community maintaining its ritual practices disparaged as cultural by colonial and post-colonial regimes, while officially submitting majority religious communities to their ritual prerogatives. Although the story is set in one city and focuses on one festival, it highlights a wider pattern in post-colonial Africa, the uneasy desire to honor tradition while disciplining it through imported categories of governance. The Ghana negotiations around sound reveal a secular order that is not based on the displacement of customary authority, but on its strategic incorporation, concealment, and reactivation. What emerges is a portrait of a political landscape in which indigenous forms of knowledge and power persist, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly, shaping the contours of modern life, even as they're continually reframed by the state. Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you, Mariam. Our first respondent is Christoph Kleine. He is professor at the History of Religions at the Institute for the History of Religions at the Institute for the Study of Religion here at Leipzig University. His research spans Buddhism in East Asia, Japanese religious history, and theory and methodology in the study of religion. He is, as Mariam already said, the co-director of the Center for Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Sciences, Multiple Secularities. Christoph, it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I must say that reading your book, Maria, was a genuine treat. So the book offers really, it's a clear recommendation, so please buy it. So the book offers an exceptionally dense, theoretically sophisticated and empirically precise analysis of the ban on drumming in Accra. Combining the multiple secularities approach with post-colonial theory, sound studies, and anthropology of the senses and critical religious studies, it uses a seemingly local phenomenon to reframe major questions in the study of religion in general. And although I was familiar with the broad outlines of your project due to your involvement in our Center for Advanced Studies, Multiple Secularities, as you've heard, in hindsight, I'm very glad that this event gently forced me to dive a little deeper into your fascinating research. For those who do not know me, but I was introduced kindly by Bernadette already, I should at least again give a brief disclaimer. I know next to nothing about Ghana or sub-Saharan Africa in general. So my main field, as Bernadette said, of research is the religious history of Japan. However, as co-director of the Multiple Secularities Project, I've been working on the diverse problems arising from the contested boundary drawings between the religious and the secular intensively for many years. Accordingly, my short response will focus precisely on this aspect of your work. And I must say your book makes an extremely fascinating and important contribution to our understanding of multiple secularities in global modernity. At the heart of your research, as we've already heard, are the drum wars in Accra. The case study itself is highly interesting and very entertaining to read it, namely the fact that the curators of the Ga tradition have succeeded in getting the Pentecostal churches to lower their noise emissions at least slightly for 1 month of the year, a partial success on the path to reclaiming the soundscape. What makes this a perfect example of what we aim to look at in our Multiple Secularities project is your sharp analysis of the respective rhetorical tools and legal strategies employed by the disputing parties and the specific path dependencies in the formation of Ghanaian secularity. On a terminological level, you distinguish between secularism as an ideological and institutional framework imported from Europe and secularity as the actual context-bound and flexible reality on the ground in Ghana. This alone is noteworthy because in Anglo-American discourse, a distinction between secularism and secularity is made, for my taste, far too rarely and far too vaguely. You do not treat Ghanaian secularity as an incomplete copy of the West, but as a distinct, flexible, and viable way of being secular. I would, however, like to add at this point that there was and is, of course, no single European secularism either. In fact, political ideas concerning the relationship between religion and the state, as well as the resulting institutional configurations, vary considerably across different parts of Europe. Viewed this way, the question would have been which model of secularism Ghana was supposed to copy in the first place. Generally speaking, the secularity of Europe and the West, the so-called West, during the heyday of colonialism is often vastly overestimated. In the late 19th century, the Japanese, for instance, did not perceive the West as secular at all, but as thoroughly Christian. The question, therefore, was not whether the Japanese should become secular, but whether they should become Christians in order to connect with a modernity defined and dominated by Europeans and North Americans. The only issue up for debate was one element that is usually associated with secularity, the question of religious freedom, specifically, although that of European and American Christians in Japan. However, the demand for religious freedom alone does not constitute a secularist project per se. In contrast to Japan, however, Ghana was Christianized under duress, and along with colonialism and missions, a classification system was imposed that distinguished between religion and culture. Your book shows beautifully how, from the very beginning, categorizing traditional worldviews and related practices as either religion or culture has been interest-driven and strategically motivated. What makes the whole thing so exciting and complicated now is the fact that Christianity has achieved dominance, initially in the form of the mainline churches imported from Europe, but since the 1990s, increasingly through charismatic Pentecostalism, which, as you vividly describe, is a very loud form of Christianity indeed. In the dispute over observing the 1-month period of sonic abstinence, which from a traditionalist perspective is necessary for the gods to carry out their work on earth undisturbed, categorization now becomes a central tool for asserting specific interests. On one side are the Ga traditionalists demanding compliance with the quiet period, and on the other are the Pentecostal churches who insist on communicating with the transcendent loudly. The Ga traditionalists point to a tradition that has been elevated to national cultural heritage. In principle, the land, we've heard about that, on which the city of Accra was built, belongs to them, which includes their ancestors and gods who occasionally need their peace and quiet. In their reading, the Christian churches are essentially just tenants who ought to follow the house rules. Instead, they make unbearable noise day and night. Just a brief side note in this context, your research also beautifully demonstrates the links between technological developments and religious practice. Without the widespread availability of powerful sound systems and their very specific affordance, the dispute between the Ga traditionalists and the Pentecostal churches would probably never have escalated to this extent. From a scholarly perspective, that would have been a pity, as we would have missed out on the study. So the book also provides impressive confirmation of a central premise of the Multiple Secularities project. We have repeatedly faced the criticism that one cannot meaningfully speak of secularity without presupposing at least a rough working definition of religion. My response has always been, it is not up to us to define what stands on either side of the form we call secularity. Local actors determine what they classify as religious and what as secular. The attributes religious and secular are just floating signifiers loaded with content on specific occasions, that is, situationally, and for specific purposes. Whenever people recognize the possibility and the need to classify things as either religious or secular, we are dealing with a form of secularity. I've rarely seen a study that illustrates this as clearly as yours. The Ga culturalize their tradition, the Pentecostals religionize theirs. The crucial point, however, is that both sides draw upon secular rhetoric, discourses, and legal frameworks to do so. Pentecostal churches refer to human rights and religious freedom. The Ga community argues using culture, tradition, and cultural heritage, and sees itself supported at least partly by state authorities who view this as an opportunity to strengthen national identity via culture. The irony in deploying different secular arguments for their respective purposes is that both parties fundamentally adhere to more or less the same ontology, which is anything but secular. Both assume the existence of transcendent powers that react to drumming and other noises. So we are not dealing with a conflict of diverging ontologies here. In the case of competing ontologies, it would be entirely plausible to appeal to the secular state as a neutral arbiter that does not privilege any single ontology. Here, however, both parties translate their religious needs, which are based on a largely shared religious ontology, into a secular language. And this makes me wonder to what extent the Ghanaian secularity you describe aligns with Jürgen Habermas' ideal of a post-secular society. As I understand it, Habermas proposes that in a post-secular society, secular people should take religious convictions and sensibilities seriously. Religious people, however, must translate these into a secular language to make them viable in public discourse. Isn't this exactly what's happening in Ghana? Another question I think is worth discussing is the extent to which Ghanaian secularity really differs fundamentally from European debates over drawing boundaries between the religious and the secular. We repeatedly see attempts, who I refer to culturalize Christianity in order to evade accusations of violating negative religious freedom by placing Christian symbols in public buildings. Conversely, groups like Scientology choose a strategy of religionization in order to claim religious freedom and enjoy certain privileges. Is this not in principle the same, namely attempts to assert political and institutional interests by selectively and situationally choosing either a strategy of culturalization or religionization? And by the way, it's not without a certain irony that in their battle over the soundscape, the GA also appealed to the British colonial administration's public nuisance ordinance, a law that was clearly discriminatory towards indigenous traditions in the beginning. A proper religion, according to the colonizers, had to take place at a moderate volume. Loud drumming, singing, etc. were markers of a lack of civilization and of true religion. Consequently, indigenous systems of belief and practice were usually not recognized as religion at all. They were mere culture. The strategy of culturalization thus clearly has a colonial history, but is now being used as a weapon by the formerly colonized and still marginalized. Today in Ghana, it is the adherents of Christianity, allegedly the most civilized religion out there, who make the most noise, without being denied the attribute of real religion, therefore. But aside from that, the appeal to the public nuisance ordinance strongly reminds me of the evidently pretextual arguments used by opponents of mosque construction in Europe, for instance, where people like to cite noise protection, fire safety, or limited parking spaces while actually meaning something else entirely. In Accra, as in Leipzig and elsewhere, we are essentially dealing with a certain strategically motivated insincerity, I dare say. And one final point, while reading, I kept wondering whether the term secular sacred in relation to Ga customs might be useful. Eike Rotz and others use this concept to illustrate that sacrality can also be ascribed to something secular when it is considered somewhat unnegotiable and somewhat untouchable. Is the same not true for Ga culture, which has been declared a national heritage and thereby sacralized? The ban on drumming is demanded with reference to secular law, but for this law to be successfully claimed, the sacredness of the matter in question must be asserted to some extent. Or am I mistaken there? So maybe we can talk about these points and others if people besides me are interested in that. I have no idea. And if we have time for that, thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. Our second respondent is online, Laura Thompson. She's a visiting assistant professor of anthropology at Skidmore College. She previously held a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard University's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and has taught at Boston University and Miami University. Her work focuses on the anthropology of Islam and the study of emotion, especially in North Africa. She's currently completing a book on blasphemy cases in modern Tunisia. Laura, floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much. So it's a pleasure to talk about Mariam's book. I have taught it in introductory anthropology courses at Boston University, and students have repeatedly found her emphasis on hierarchy of sound and also on the nature of silence particularly useful to think with. And so I'm going to talk briefly about the themes that I find most interesting and also most teachable in her book, and also about the interesting contributions that it makes to the study of religion more broadly. So Mariam starts her book, as she did with her presentation, by doing what the best ethnographies do, by giving a genealogy to the present, resisting ocular centrism, including in how we study colonialism. This book names sound as a category through which the British colonial powers exerted control on the Gold Coast. Here, Mariam gives a 19th century lineage to contemporary debates about sounds that are too much. She shows that in the colonial project, sounds were also used as sources of truth about one's civilizedness, and that one's production of certain undesirable sounds, such as sonically outlandish drums during traditional funerals in 1860s Accra, was used to explain Gold Coast colonization. Mariam also shows that colonial disdain for Accra's sounds under British rule was part of a broader 19th century middle and upper class Euro-American understanding that noise conceptualized a sound that was not spatially contained and therefore controlled, like music. So very interesting distinction, that this noise impaired, quote, the efficient functioning of the mind. In this way, then we see how bad sounds in Britain and the British colonies and elsewhere were understood as produced by those living on the margins, the lower classes, those laboring with their bodies and the colonized. And Mariam's capacious analysis also shows us how this way of understanding noise as noxious was widespread in the early part of the 20th century. She takes us even in a very interesting moment for me to Baltimore, Maryland, where she talks about an anti-noise policeman who is, she writes, reported to have quashed a surprising range of noises, including those made by, quote, squeaky wheeled trolleys, a baker noisily unloading bread from his wagon, raucous school children, and 3 roosters. Through this genealogy of the present, then, Mariam tells us a story of the domestication of technologies of the governing by the governed. Specifically, as she told us, she focuses on the contemporary Ga community in Accra, a traditional religious group who in the 19th century was demoted to the status of a cultural group by British colonizers, who also labeled the Ga's use of sound as garish and improper, as inferior to the sounds of Christian congregations. And then, as Mariam shows, in post-colonial Ghana, the Ga have successfully seized upon colonial techniques of sound regulation as a means of controlling the public space in the present. The right to make sound is, as Mariam outlines, a means of claiming space. Like the British in the 19th century, then, the Ga in the 1990s came to label the noises emitted by a rival religious group, specifically the well-funded, higher class, and wildly popular Pentecostal Charismatic Christians, as, quote, rowdy, barbaric, and demonic, as auditory pollution. In this argument and its scaffolding, Mariam also makes a careful methodological point for religious studies scholars that I found very interesting and very plainly laid out. In attempting to revive the study of traditional African religions, the study of religion, Mariam points out, has largely unknowingly adopted the perspective of the dominant religion, in this case, Christianity. In other words, in an effort to return indigenous religion to the fold, then, scholars have positioned it as dominated, as marginal, as, quote, suspended outside the common trajectory of history. Mariam's analysis here shows instead that in the case of the Ghanaian Harvest Festival, it is in fact the Ga community and its traditional religious authorities who are setting the terms of engagement, an urban space with local Christians, who must respond to their claims that charismatic Christians' exuberant noise is disruptive, polluting, and at least partially foreign. Mariam leaves us then with an unexpected turn of events, assuming the position of culture, as the also previous speaker said, has in the contemporary moment brought the Ga particular advantages, though with some ambivalent results, as detailed in Mariam's final chapter. In her analysis of the contemporary ban on drumming during the Ga harvest festivals and related battles over who could make sounds during that sacred month, Mariam also looks closely at what she calls acoustemologies, or the ways the Ga and the Pentecostal charismatic groups understand sound and its relationship to human-defined relations. Mariam reminds us through her ethnography of the way that sound can excite those gathered, for better or worse, can channel spiritual outpouring, can draw people into a space or a ritual from nearby streets, or can wake them up at 3 a.m. in the morning and inspire a letter to the editor in complaint. During the month-long harvest festival, the Ga, Mariam tells us, describe themselves as fasting from most noise, even in some cases from the whistling of children, so as to not interrupt the deity's assistance in ensuring the success of the harvest. But then, as Mariam shows, the Ga's ritual silence is, like all silence, only empty of certain sounds. Throughout the month, the Ga may also, for instance, broadcast, quote, uninterrupted Pele ritual songs, both live and recorded, which are, quote, sometimes as loud as Pentecostal charismatic worship. And then, in the Ga's understanding, it is not just humans who are affected by sounds, but also deities who may request particular songs that they like, and who may be distracted by sounds they don't like. Sounds like popular music, Christian songs, drumming, clapping, car engines, shouting, speaking into a microphone, or, as one Ga informant puts it, by, quote, any form of sound that makes noise. On the other hand, Mariam details how Pentecostal charismatic churches in Accra embrace what she calls exuberant worship, broadcast from sound systems to ears far beyond its gathered worshipers, including to Mariam in her apartment at 5 a.m. As she tells us in her conclusion, I believe her landlord eventually files a complaint with the local Accra authorities. Mariam's charismatic Christian informants, on the other hand, describe their sounds, especially their shouts and cries, as weapons, as tools for making their God known to others, as means of sharpening their pious muscles, and as mechanisms for generating a sense of joy and purpose in the world. Passers-by, even if not believers, can receive blessings or can be drawn into the service through its vivid sonality. For both the Ga and the Pentecostal charismatic congregations, then, sound is important. It is not only a reflection of a state that exists, but it is also productive, a means of creating a state that one is seeking out. And for both groups, as Mariam tells us, sound is a means of crossing the line between the profane and sacred worlds. Mariam also underlines here significant epistemological divides around sound that I found very helpful. Protestant churches, she points out, do not quite have a sonic theology, an insistence on precise sounds at necessary ritual moments. And this, she says, has significantly inhibited their ability to recognize and condone the Ga sensory order. This is an interesting corollary to the larger body of work done on religion and space, which has proposed that Protestant Christianity's relative indifference to place, one can, after all, move from church to church, makes Protestant Christianity uncomprehending when confronted with religious practices that must be performed, for example, on a particular piece of land. Here we see incomprehension in relation to sounds, and particularly sounds that others perceive as meaningless, empty, disruptive, as noise. I'll finish by complimenting Mariam on the way she introduces her positionality to help us think about her own insiderness, outsiderness as a post-imperial but differently racialized researcher, and as someone with her own acoustemology. In one of the most fascinating moments of the book, Mariam describes a heated conversation with Victor Yankee from the Evangel Church International, who notes her surprise when he proposes that one might feel tranquility from loud music. I understand where you are coming from, the Orthodox Christian setting, where everything is low-key, Victor tells Mariam. But once the sound is good, it affects you emotionally. even though the sound might be a little loud, it can be peaceful. Listening to Victor's account, Mariam writes, I began to realize that what my untrained ears registered as simply loud music could only be appreciated in its full splendor with the right spiritual attunement. Only with a proper sensory and spiritual disposition would the fervid shouts of worshipers become a weapon that, according to Victor, the God Almighty uses to conquer the enemy. Mariam has listened to how she listens, and here she helps us do the same. Indeed, Mariam's care with language in writing this ethnography reflects how deeply she has thought about sound. Her book is a pleasure to read from beginning to end. She opens it identifying the city of Accra, as she did in her presentation as well, not simply as full of noise, but as, quote, buzzing, humming, panting, and puffing. She helps us hear the city through her, and also, like all good ethnographies, helps us hear our own cities and traditions differently. Thank you.
Maybe you want to respond to Christoph's and Laura's comments?
You don't
We
have
still
to.
have some minutes.
I think I will. I mean, I will do that, and then we can talk about, because I mean, there is a lot to work with there, but yeah.
So we wrap it up.
Yeah, we can.
So thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you. And thank you to the respondents. And have a good evening, everybody. See you.
Thank you so much.